Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Bold New Futures Standing Committee. We are so excited to welcome you, very excited to have some wonderful conversation this evening and to work through a few different things here on our agenda. I want to go ahead and first address that hopefully there'll be minimal distractions or interruptions behind me as I am here this evening. Hopefully no interruptions, hoping for the best. So I am outside and in a different environment than I'm usually in when I'm meeting. So want to address that just first off here. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get started we're going to hear from Susan Strange, who is here with us to talk about Slack and to talk about some collaboration opportunities across our different standing committees. So I will go ahead and turn things over to Susan.
Make sure everybody can hear me. Thank you, Caleb, and thank you all for having me. I am going to share my screen so that you all can see what I'm seeing. As Caleb said, there's been an overwhelming want for cross-committee collaboration, and so I looked into some technology resources that might help us ease that a little bit. And so one of the programs is called Slack. And so you will receive an email from me that looks like this, if everybody can see my screen. And it'll ask you to join. I'm going to click on this because this link doesn't work for me, but you'll just click the Join Now link, and it will pull up Slack for you. It'll take a second for me to get logged in. I am going to send it to the email address that I have on file for you, but you're going to sign in with Google or with your email address, whatever you want to do to sign up for the program here. Sorry, it's running a little slow tonight. Okay, so when you come in, you will come into the welcome screen, and I have included some guidelines that I'm going to go over with you. And there's a link to a channel guide document. If you click on the channel guide document, it will just kind of show you what the channels are and what they're for. And then also the guidelines are posted down here on the document as well. So I'm going to go back to the Slack program and kind of go over these guidelines a little bit. So first and foremost, because this is not a KDE program, we don't want to share or post any sensitive information. So no passwords, no student names or information, no files. All of our files are still going to be kept in Google Drive. If you want to share a file in Slack, you can share the link, but we're not going to actually put files in the Slack program. We're also not paying for the pro version, so we're using the free version, which means we will lose some conversations at some point, but I'll try to moderate and save conversations as I see how important they are in Google Drive. Okay, please remember that this is just a communication platform. This is just a tool to help open up communication across the committees and among the members of the council. There is no expectation of a specific time frame on responses from leadership, facilitators, or even other members. So be respectful of people's time. This is just a way for us to easily communicate. If you want to create a new channel for any reason, message me and I'll evaluate if it's necessary or if it's something that can go in general chat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Some general rules of thumb when joining a large community like this, if you guys don't mind going through and reading those, this is going to be a large community. We're over 80 people are going to be in this platform, and I am only one moderator, and I'm going to do my best to moderate. But there are going to be some general rules of thumb that you need to follow to make that organized and easy. And then we have these non-negotiables. I don't think they're going to be a problem, but just so you know, if you do harassment of any participant in any form or violent threats or language, you'll just be removed from the platform. Um, And then I've got some helpful tips on here, and this will be a growing document. As we run into some issues, we'll add some more guidelines, or if you find a helpful tip that you want to share with everybody, let me know and I'll add that in, so that everybody can keep this growing here. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the left-hand side here, which is your menu. I have a lot more channels than you all do because I'm the workspace owner, but these are the channels where things will happen. You all will have this Bold New Future, and this is where all of the members of the Bold New Future Committee can go into. Caleb can post things there. You all can have discussions there on Bold New Future. Whatever you need to do in that channel, it's a private channel for just Bold New Future committee members. I'm going to skip the general chat for a second. I'm actually going to bounce back up to announcements here. Announcements is where admin, which is like the leadership team, myself, Karen, Donnie, might share, Audrey, might share announcements that we feel is important to get out to all of the council. These will still go out in email form, but this is just a place to have them if you want to use this as well. Skipping general chat, I'll come back to that in a minute. We also have Portrait of a Learner update and information section. At the top of every channel, you'll see a quick description of what the channel is. This one allows you to post to it, but I'm going to ask that you don't post to this channel. I'm leaving this open for Meredith to post updates as the KBE makes updates with Portrait of a Learner, and this is just an information channel for everyone. So if you do want to comment on it, or then you'll start a thread in the general chat. And again, I'll talk about that in a second over this. And that's where the conversation will happen. And we'll just leave this for information on Portrait of a Learner. Then we have a channel called Related Information. This would be, we've gotten some emails from people who want to share things out with you all about what's happening outside of Cool Council, but maybe something you want to look into. So we've got a channel for that if you have a desire to go looking for other things. And then we'll have a channel for useful links, which will link you to the council member Google Drive, member contact information folder, or we might add other things in there as we come upon links that we think are useful for the council members. Okay, so going back to the general chat, this channel is where the majority of things are going to happen. This is where the majority of the conversation is going to happen. And there's something in here called threads. And what threads are is they're going to keep the conversations from getting out of hand. With 80 people in here and people replying on conversations, it'll get crazy. So I want to show you that for just a second. So let's say that you want to start a conversation, you want to start it around a topic. And let's say you want that topic to be somebody's favorite color. So you could say, you could ask a question, or you could just put the topic favorite color and post that. So then if you wanted to ask a question under that, or if you wanted to reply to that, you're going to come over to the right here where it says reply in thread. And then what that does is that creates a whole thread under that favorite color. So then I could put green as my favorite color and add that one. Or I could go in and say blue is my favorite color, or pink, or red. And do you see how over here it's staying collapsed under that favorite color? That's going to keep it from getting out of hand. Now, navy blue, great. Caleb, yes. So now we want to make sure we're not clicking this box, also send to general chat, because that's going to make it to where it doesn't matter if we're doing the thread or not, because now it's still going to show up down here in the general chat. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're keeping it under that thread. This will also make it easier for you to be able to go through and search the general chat for a topic so that you can comment on that topic and not be posting the same topic over and over and over again. So as we go through this and I'm moderating this, I might send you all messages and be like, hey, remember to use threads. So just to try to keep things organized. With 80 plus people, we want to make sure that we're being as efficient and organized as we possibly can be. There are direct messaging that you can do with people. You can do mentions and reactions in here. So just have fun, play around with it. If you all have any questions, please let me know. Just be patient with this. It is going to be ever changing, and we're just going to, figure things out as we go. There was talk about I might be sending out, we're going to talk about it in the leadership team tomorrow, but Accelerating Innovation members ask about maybe signing off on I read the guidelines. So I'm going to present that to leadership team tomorrow, and see if that's something I'm going to send out to everyone. But we'll see how this goes. If you have any suggestions or ideas or questions, please, 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 you can message me on Slack, you can email me, and we'll get through it together. So, do I have any questions from anybody right now? Okay, I think that was adequate wait time. All right, so what I'm going to do when I get off of this phone call is I'm going to go on and send your invites to you, and you should get that email invite and just get in there and start having conversations. So, thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Susan. Susan, so glad you were able to join and appreciate your help there. I actually would like to say that earlier I was struggling to find our agenda for the evening. And so when I started the meeting off there, I was trying to remember exactly how things would flow. Luckily, we are in good shape right now. So the next item on our agenda this evening is a discussion of our BNF presentation to the Kentucky Board of Education. And as many of you know, that is coming up in August. And so we are in the process right now of building out that presentation. And we certainly want to hear from you and ensure that your thoughts as the steering committee are informing the presentation that we're preparing to present to the Kentucky Board of Education. And so I will go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Tammy Schiff. She is here and has helped us in the past in our community and communications-based work. And so excited to have her here to explain some more about the presentation leading up to ours and to provide some more context as to how things might look at the board meeting that's coming up. So I'll go ahead and turn things over.
Thanks, Caleb. I appreciate it. No need, we got the formalities going, but so we thought maybe kind of do some stage setting since obviously not everybody will be at the board retreat and be able to enjoy, as Meredith has warned me, the mosquitoes and things like that and the heat. So anyway, there's a couple of us, I think, that are participating in this presentation, and let me know if you have trouble hearing me or anything like that. So as I've described it, or it's evolved, we're kind of viewing this presentation. Caleb called me earlier. He goes, describe the sandwich for them. So if you visualize a sandwich with like regular bread, kind of vertically, there's the first piece of bread, and the first piece of bread of this the presentation is basically a presentation in 3 parts. And the end game, or what the leave behind, or what we want the board to acquire through this presentation, is a really solid base and understanding of some data that's been collected by various parts of the KDE organization around implementation for Portrait of a Learner, and the data that we collectively gathered between Bold New Futures and the Accelerated Learning subcommittees related to Portrait of a Learner through what we're calling the task. And then the part 3 would be, okay, board, you've now heard all this information and backdrop. Here's some guiding questions and leave behinds, and what we think you want to do next with it. And it's not in the case of a recommendation, but really an interactive activity that they can work together and start to process what they've heard and come to some of their own conclusions, recommendations, questions for what's next, those sorts of things. So visualize the sandwich. The first piece of bread will be Sarah Snipes and myself presenting the results of a survey that went out to, now we've got about 43 responses to districts who are fairly far along on the continuum of implementing their own portraits of learners or the state's portrait of learner, and what they've done in that implementation process. And the survey basically asked them, where are you on this continuum that Sarah STEAM has developed. And Sarah, if you're on here, I've lost my grid, so I'm not sure if you're here. So where they are in that continuum, and then we very specifically asked them to provide us with some examples at any grade level and across any level of schooling, examples of projects or initiatives or things that maybe a teacher at a certain grade level is doing relative to trying to teach the competencies that are showing up in their portrait of a learner. So we've got some pretty fun, in some cases, examples of, in particular, deeper learning, project-based learning kind of examples that we're in the process of sort of organizing and figuring out how to present all of this to the board. But basically our flow is we're going to try and present examples at each of the 3 school levels, so elementary, middle, high school, and trying to create a sense that they understand, sort of the breadth of how competencies are infused into the curriculum and instruction at the building level. So that's the first piece of bread. The middle piece is what Caleb is going to walk you through, which is kind of a summary of the results of what we're calling the task that was sent out to the BNF, asking them to go speak to their networks or friends, families, constituents, what have you, to understand their level of awareness for the concept of portrait of a learner, and very specifically to look at what's considered sort of the proposed graduation requirement changes and respond to that relative to what they see as benefits, challenges, still burning questions or concerns that they may have, so that we could kind of cull all that into a bucket of data to leave with the board. So that's the middle part of the presentation. And then our vision is that sort of Sarah and I come back and propose some guiding questions to the board, so that then they can break off into maybe groups of 2s and 3s and sort of chew on everything, if you will, and digest everything that they've heard in the give and get part of this presentation, and come to some either conclusions or questions or concerns or next steps, and then bring that back into a holistic conversation amongst the board. Likes, dislikes, concerns, questions? Anything? Hearing none and seeing nothing pop up on chat. So Caleb is going to walk you through call it the drafty draft of our middle part of the presentation. We anticipate having somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes to walk the board through this and sort of answer questions and things like that. And so this is the middle piece.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being willing to talk with the group about how we've been comparing this to a sandwich, sort of, as we prepare for our upcoming presentation. So exciting, right, that we're going to have this opportunity, certainly to represent the perspectives of stakeholders and so forth. So I want to go ahead and start off just by saying that I'm looking very forward to traveling to Dale Hollow in August, and I have invited our Vice Chair Bentley White to tag along, and hopefully he'll be able to make it as well to present this presentation that we have drafted here. And I want to go ahead and just say that this is very much a draft, and so things are certain to change in a number of ways. I'll go ahead and start walking you through it, though, and please, collect your thoughts and so forth, and we'll discuss some of those ideas that you might have on improving this once we have looked through it. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started here. So, Bold New Futures Standing Committee, right? We're talking about our Portrait of a Learner reflection task. I know that our group has been involved with that, as well as some folks from other groups as well. All right. So our near-term goal, and I had actually planned to start our meeting off with mentioning this, however, did not have the opportunity due to that issue that I was facing with our agenda. So we said at the last convening that over the next 6 months, the BNF committee will specifically work to build capacity and increase engagement among communities, families, and students to support policy implementation that supports the reimagining of the education system in the Commonwealth by collecting data from every district to understand the values of skills like those on state and local portraits of a learner to inform aligned changes to state graduation requirements. And so specifically here, we're looking at Portrait of a Learner and those changes to state graduation requirements in these slides that you'll be seeing. So I want to go ahead and ground our thinking in our goal here of building capacity, increasing engagement, and thinking about how this implementation is occurring across the state and what it might look like moving forward. All right, so our overview. A version of potential grad requirements and amendments based on the previously KBE approved additions to the early graduate program were shared with our committee and Accelerating Innovation Portrait of a Learner subcommittee to solicit feedback and insights from stakeholders through an interview-based task. And I appreciate all the folks who were involved with helping to get this out and helping us collect data for this. So we'll move forward here. The goals of the tasks, the objectives of the tasks were to hear directly from Kentucky stakeholders concerning the proposed changes to graduation requirements to help inform the Board of Education's direction with this work. And so, what kind of listening and messaging is needed to explain to Kentucky stakeholders the current landscape around Portrait of a Learner development? What might it look like, the perceived impact look like of modifications to graduation requirements? And then also the task really was to reflect on the different networks of which we are members and to use the guiding questions to gather feedback. And so we'll go ahead and move forward from here. All right, so our research design. We asked a number of key questions. So questions like, are you familiar with the concept of a Portrait of a Learner? Reflecting on your own schooling experience, can you think of a project lesson assignment that would have allowed you to develop the knowledge, skills, and dispositions outlined in the portrait? Was that experience valuable? From your own perspective, what are some of the potential benefits associated with the proposed changes to Kentucky graduation requirements to incorporate demonstrations of learning? From your own perspective, what are some of the potential challenges associated with the proposed changes? And if you looked over the survey, hopefully you did, you'll certainly know that you've seen these. So as of July 1st, 7/1/2023, we had a total of 23 responses. It's qualitative input, but it's certainly not a balanced or representative sample of stakeholders. And I felt it was important to include this just to point out that this is really more of a pulse check. And so it provides us with some ideas as to what folks might be thinking, but it's also important to note that when you look especially at the administrator, student, and community member perspectives, that there are highly, in terms of probability, it's highly likely that there are some varying thoughts among those groups that might not be represented here. And so that's certainly something that I do want to point out as we think about this. Right, so first question that we asked was, are you familiar with the concept of a Portrait of a Learner? 17 responded that they are familiar, 5 responded that they are not familiar, and then there was one person who did not provide an answer for a total of the 23 responses there. Focus question number 2. Now, I'm going to allow you all to take some time to look at these yourselves and to really think about the slide here. Reflecting on your own school experience, can you think of a project lesson assignment that would have allowed you to develop the knowledge, skills, and dispositions outlined in the portrait? Was that experience valuable? And so we found that the data that we gathered, it focused on experiences. The respondents focused on experiences over time and cumulative impact and their relationships with teachers. They also focused on we found that a theme we found was that culminating projects, especially writing portfolios, are not viewed as valuable. And so you can see there various quotes from those stakeholder groups that a couple of those stakeholder groups that we had mentioned earlier, a few of those stakeholder groups. So administrators, educators, and parents have some perspective here on this slide. And I'll go ahead and I'll give you just a moment to look over those and read through some of those quotes there. All right, so now that we've had just a moment to look over those, Please note that after we look through the entire presentation, we can always come back if you have a thought or a question that might relate to something on the slides. So please keep that in mind. We'll move on to our focus question number 3. That question was, from your own perspective, what are some of the potential benefits associated with the proposed changes to Kentucky graduation requirements to incorporate demonstrations of learning? And you'll see here on this slide, one of the themes that we found was that few benefits were mentioned. Most questioned the benefit of the change. And so our educator, we have an educator here, a parent, a student, so forth, several, a couple stakeholder groups mentioned here. And so if I'll again give you a second just to look through these and to think about this slide here. All right, we will go ahead and we will move forward to focus question. I'm sorry, I apologize. It appears as though there might actually be a couple slides here for focus question 3. And so we'll note that some of these might actually require a couple slides. And so that is something that we're thinking about as we build out the presentation. And that's because there is, there's a lot here within this qualitative data that we collected. So we want to be sure that we have a good representation here in the quotes that we pull and so forth. So go ahead and I'll give you just a moment to look over this slide as well. All right, we will go ahead and move on to focus question number 4. And that question was, from your own perspective, what are some of the potential challenges associated with the proposed changes? And so we noticed that there was a focus on implementation, assessment, teacher and student time, and equity. And so you'll see here that parents, administrators, and educators are all represented in this qualitative data here. I'll give you a moment to look over this slide. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll move forward here. So here we present a number of takeaways that we found. And we need to continue to build awareness and understanding for Portrait of a Learner, positive perceptions around the value of teaching portrait competencies, pre-existing negative perceptions of portfolios, impacted opinions, implementation of new graduation requirements seen as problematic and challenging. One more thing on the plate for schools and teachers. Questions of providing equity across student groups. Grad requirement changes perceived as beneficial for students who already excel, but maybe not for students who may be struggling. Concerns around grading and assessment of portfolios described as subjective and uneven. Concerns raised from all respondents, especially educators, as to the necessity and value of changing these graduation requirements. And so one educator said, do companies and businesses even care about this? Is it going to help kids get a job or scholarships? If not, it's a waste of time. And so again, these are takeaways that that came about through a detailed analysis of the data that we collected, of that qualitative data that we have. And so certainly these are all informed by the perspectives that we gathered insight from. And we also wanted to be sure that we included some information here for board members to think about. And so if graduation requirements were to change, what supports are needed as we think about implementation. So it's important, to define benefits, to make the value proposition case for all stakeholders. Developing measurement and assessment system or grading criteria to avoid subjectivity and demonstrate positive outcomes related to the change. Also, increased administrator and teacher training and planning time must be considered. Communications and community engagement for all stakeholders must be considered. And then, of course, supports for students with special needs. We want to ensure that all of our students are supported in their learning. And we also have some other concerns here, and we will eventually develop this out. The plan is to continue to use that qualitative data. And you can see here we do have some quotes on this slide as well. Now, next steps. So, what will we do next as a group to achieve our near-term goal, our 6-month goal or so forth? We recognize that additional and broader research to ensure adequate representation from all stakeholders is needed. I certainly see that, and I imagine that you all see that as well, seeing as we do only have the 23 responses as of right now, or as of July 1st. And so certainly that is something that we're thinking about moving forward. I'd welcome any ideas that you might have also on what our next steps might look like. And that is it, I do believe. So I will go ahead and stop sharing here, and I will open things up and open the floor up and allow anyone who would be interested in asking any questions or raising any concerns, or who might have any initial thoughts, would welcome that now.
Caleb, I did have a quick question. Do we know if the people who responded that they hadn't heard of this or they weren't familiar at all with this, which ones their responses were, particularly about implementation? Because if we gave them like a short description, they wouldn't necessarily have like the full picture to talk about implementation. That just might be good context to have when sharing these quotes.
Yeah. Actually, I'll allow if Lillian would like to speak more to that, as I know that Lillian has been involved with the analysis, and then of course Tammy and so forth. I'll go ahead and allow them to talk about that for just a moment.
So Caleb, I'll jump in really quick.
Yeah, I was going to say Meredith is probably best for this.
So yes, we would be able to tell just based upon their responses. We can see the full row. Obviously, we kept the survey as anonymous as we could. No emails were collected. We don't have any information, demographic information. So they were able to self-report what their role was within the K-12 setting, but we could certainly try to match up those who said they were not familiar with their responses and try to extrapolate some meaning from that. I think that's a great idea.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Dr. Brewer. And I hope that answered your question, Audrey.
Yep. Thanks.
Great. All right. So do we have any other?
Caleb, there were some comments in the chat that maybe
Okay,
you
yeah, absolutely.
put eyes on.
Okay.
And I think one of the questions early on was, do we know which groups participated? I think Kathy, which representatives do we have from each group?
Yes,
And that was actually a question that we wanted to pose tonight, because as we were digging into, and I think my watch out would be kind of hanging too much on this as quote unquote data, because remember it's 23 responses and it's very directed in that it was a task that was put out to the BNF, who then turned around and did the interviews with their networks and acquaintances. So from a sampling perspective, it's not clean. And that's the researcher ahead in me. Sorry, I have to watch out to hang too much on it. But what we wanted to know as we were looking at these responses is, one thing we didn't know is how many people on the BNF actually went out and did the task, and with how many of their, if you will, friends and families and acquaintances and network. And that's one of the key questions that we don't know, is whether, one person out of the BNF did 10 of these, or 10 of these kind of interviews, and how many from accelerated learning actually, completed the task. And it would be this isn't a oh, you're in trouble if you didn't do it kind of thing, but just as looking at this feedback, it would be interesting to know if, maybe a collection of the educators somebody says, well, I did 6 of them in my district, like we would know kind of clustering where they might come from. It's not something that we would report to the board. And so Julie, like, plug your ears. I'm looking at you on the screen. But it just as like looking at the feedback, it's interesting. It would be interesting to know the sources. So if anyone wants to own up here, like that they did all 20.
I see that Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with that, because you can have pockets of bubbles where portrait of graduate is talked about. Like we have one in Boone County, it was all community developed. So that kind of group of people would have very different responses than a community that doesn't, it's not talked about in their community at all.
And I do believe that, and thank you, Julie. I do believe that Kathy has her hand raised.
Well, the question that I was asking was because I noticed that there was one community member that responded, but in all the ones that you posted about the responses, you didn't post anything about what the community member said. So that's something to consider. And I asked the question because I was wondering how many community members do we have? How many parents do we have? And just so the board can see. Right. And maybe they probably already know, but it just as a reminder. But there's nothing posted about what the community member had to say.
Well, thank you for that, and absolutely, that's something that we will consider.
Yeah, I will say, Kathy, to that question, in looking at the commentary from the community member, it was in a way very much echoing some of the less positive comments of a couple of the educators. And so you may be right that we need to like identify like one quote from the community member and kind of isolate that. But for example, it was, in line with I don't see many benefits. So I just, in looking at it, it was like, which was the best quote to include. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. I'm so sorry. I think my internet may have went out for just a moment. I hope that you're.
Yeah. I think Caleb's in and out there. Interesting comment. Jim's comment about removing things from teacher and administrators' plates to relieve the perception that this is just one more thing piling on. I think that's I appreciate that as we were getting towards the end of like, okay, what do we want to leave behind as like ideas or concepts that maybe the board could then in their interactive time kind of digest and think about and consider. And I think that's really valuable. So I'll poke that one in there. And Edna also, just because I think, Caleb, are you back or are you like off? I can't tell.
I hope that you're able to hear me okay. Are you able to hear me okay?
I'm just reading from the chat. Edna, can we add other questions like, is your district in L3? Are you familiar with the COOL report? I think, remember, because you all have the task and you had like the outline of the script, that it wasn't really completely designed as a survey. It was a qualitative, let's have a conversation about these things. And that's why I think in the recommendations part, doing additional research so that we get a broader representative sample of stakeholders for this. And so I think that's a really good suggestion. And somebody else in the chat mentioned, how does this, did we talk specifically to some L3 districts about, because they're further along in Portrait of a Learner. So I think it's important to remember that the collective, we didn't talk to them. You all as BNF committee members, standing committee members, went out and chose who you talked to about this. But I think the idea that maybe some more time invested in some data collection and research is extremely valuable at this point, based on just hearing at least these opinions that you all did go out and gather. Yeah, students, same, Paul. Yeah, the representation is not balanced. If you look at the number of educators compared to, it was only one student. There was a couple of educator-parent combos, and only one who identified strictly as a community member. So that's what I mean, is that it's not broad.
Right, and I think that one thing I'll add in thinking about this presentation and using the data that we have, I hope you're able to hear me now. Okay, wonderful. I apologize for the issues that I'm having. I think that one thing that I have definitely thought about is that it is a next step for us to continue. And so this is just more of a baseline, as I described earlier, a pulse check, right? And so we know that there are certainly perspectives out there that might differ from the perspectives that we've collected. But in terms of this presentation, we have this data now to work with. And so moving forward, every intention of collecting more data, but for now with this presentation, I think we do have a pulse check on some of the different perspectives that are across the state when it comes to this implementation. So I also noticed that, let's see here. Looks like there's another response here in the chat. If this seems like adding extra work, what is something that is being done now that could
think we lost Caleb again.
All right, so let's see here. I see Meredith has linked the task in the chat.
Can we loop back, because there's a couple of comments about like the responses and stuff, kind of straw poll from BNF, and I think there's 2 members of Accelerated Learning on here, and maybe you could just respond in chat if you did the task and how many people you interviewed. And there's no shame blame thing here. We're just really curious, like, did a whole bunch of them come from like one place or the other, that sort of thing, because people are asking that question, like, where did these people come from? Because I think it's really important to remember that this wasn't a distributed broad scale survey. There was that intentionality of who participated. And I think we should just kind of know that in just valuing the data. And also remember that this was very much focused on the change in graduation requirements. It wasn't going a deep dive into the individuals, like knowledge recognition, complete understanding of either their localized portrait of a learner or the state portrait of a learner. That was like the first primary question. Do you know anything about it? Like a warm-up, can you tell me about a great experience you had? And then it went into, here's the proposed changes. What do you think? Thanks, Kathy.
I want to point out Dr. Flynn's response in the chat about the recent superintendent summit, an idea that it has sparked for me. Says there was a feedback to link portrait of a learner work to ILPs, accountability and school report cards, and to integrate local community accountability with the state and federal accountability requirements that we know. I can't help but think that there might be a potential next step here or more so not just necessarily with superintendents, but with stakeholders across the board. And so thinking about, how we are engaging with those communities around what Portrait of a Learner is and what exactly the grad requirement changes might look like and so forth. And so thinking about this from a communications and community engagement based perspective, I think that might be a next step. Does anyone have any thoughts there around that?
I'll say that I agree with that. I'm thinking that this the Portrait of a Learner, the task was kind of separated Portrait of the Learner from the big picture of pool. And I think what Jim is suggesting that the superintendents are talking about is we need to find ways to integrate it. We already know that, but when you're asking just a couple of questions of somebody who's not as familiar with this, they're focused more on the Portrait of the Learner, I think. And I know that KBE is looking at Portrait of a Learner specifically, but isolating it, I think, is sort of going to be counterproductive for us.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you being willing to share that. I do see a potential next step here in thinking about how we are informing stakeholders. And then also from your response, I've gathered also it might be neat to think about how we are connecting this work to the other work that we're doing. There are a lot of different pieces to this pie. And so I certainly agree with that. Do we have any additional thoughts on a potential next step here in this, or any other thoughts in general that relate to the presentation and so forth?
I'm sorry, I'm thinking a lot of things, but I don't know how to say them very well. I feel like, well, first of all, I'm guilty of not having done the task. And so I'm thinking I should try to do that. But as I look at it, I still get this, I would have to do a lot of filling in if I just asked somebody cold some of these questions. I mean, I know there are some things, are you familiar with, and that sort of thing, but is there a better way for us to get a broader input so we have more diverse responses? I'm not saying that we would get more diverse responses, but having only us go out and ask these questions may not get the diversity that we want. Does that make sense?
And I think that your thoughts there relate to Jessica's comment in the chat. Are we opening up this survey again or just moving on? And I'll allow Meredith or anyone else to speak to this as well. But just want to say that, and also Tammy might want to speak to this as well. In terms of the data that we've collected for this presentation, I don't imagine opening it up again in terms of this preparation for the presentation, but I certainly do want to point to the next step of gathering more data for future use. Do we have any other expansions on that, Tammy or Meredith?
Yeah, well, I would agree that I think leave this as is, because it's also some interesting feedback on design of quote unquote a task for this standing committee to do and those sorts of things. I think that's interesting in itself. But I think also falling forward to a recommendation and then you just suggested like, okay, how do we make time, space, and investment in maybe some broader research if the board is deeply considering modifying or changing graduation requirements? There's a lot of then either forward-looking communication, community engagement, and those sorts of things that needs to happen. And research is typically a deep part of that. So I think the way that I think it's crafted right now supports a strong recommendation to do further research, because it identifies that there's some gaps here and some information that I think we would all want to know moving forward, which would inform your how do you move forward if you're changing grad requirements and things like that. And what does the community need? What do parents need? What do staff need? To Jim's point, what potentially do you need to evaluate to take off of administrators and teachers' plates in order to make space for this to be successful? And how do you address the equity question? And I thought, to me, as an equity person, some of the commentary about concerns for equity, one of which came from the student and worrying about other kids in their school, that maybe this wouldn't be, that grad requirement change wouldn't be good for them, was an interesting piece of feedback. And so I'd love to hear, as a researcher, like, okay, let's hear a broader group of that. Julie, you had your hand, I saw your hand pop up.
Yeah, it almost really makes me kind of reflect and pause on, we really need to look at this as far as the understanding in the community and the implications of making these changes. I think, being on the Cool Council and wanting to, reimagine education and moving us forward, there's a lot of ducks to get in a row. And this really kind of makes me kind of brings things back, like that's taking things kind of one step at a time. It really makes you kind of pause and reflect, like we might be ready to move forward in this, but there's a heck of a lot of other people who are not ready, and we've got to get everybody on board in order to paddle the boat forward.
So I think one thing that we are all sort of alluding to is sort of the implementation part of this, and sort of what would it look like for us to be able, as a department, as a board, as a state, to really thoughtfully implement a change. Should the board proceed with that, right? Because we have said, I know we said in our last meeting that we're talking about the graduating class of 2028. So there is a decent runway before students will be asked to have their demonstrations of learning. However, we could potentially be talking about, the freshmen entering in 2024 needing to be thinking about the development of their portfolios or what have you, and sort of gathering that evidence. And so there's a fair amount of professional development that we'd want to be able to provide. We had several comments around how would we evaluate this? And so, teachers were interested in what would it even look like to determine that a student successfully defended, right? What does that mean? And some of these questions, and a lot of it does lie in that implementation space. So I think we need to parse out how much of this is sort of, the 23 responses for those that were skeptical or concerned, how much of it is about their readiness for that change and sort of, that feeling of there's a lot I need to understand before I'd be ready for it, versus how much of it is, I truly believe this will be problematic and not helpful, right? Like it's almost like we need to be able to fully understand the situation and make sure that we're able to hear that feedback in a productive way. Something else that we talked about when we were looking through the responses, there were a lot of references to portfolios, and those of us in education are very aware and have a fair amount of baggage with prior attempts at portfolios in the state. And so I think we have some thoughtful communication campaign that we'll need to do to make sure that people who are going to react that way understand that we too understand that there were some issues with those attempts, and that we're not asking to go back to that space again, which wasn't really terribly productive. So, you know, I think there's a lot to be gathered from these 23 responses. And I think to Tammy's point, and Julie, we have a great opportunity with you being here and as a member of the board to think about, you know, if during the retreat and the board meeting in August, the board members still feel like there's value in moving toward proposed changes in October, which was the timeline we've talked about. What does the board want to learn between August and October to feel ready to really potentially take action on those changes? Because, you know, we'll have several months, we'll have opportunities to work with the policy advisors, to reach out to the L3s, to learn more, so that should the board come back in October with those proposed amendments, they would be more equipped with kind of a broader perspective. So I think there's still time for us to gather that in maybe a more targeted way than we were able to with the task that was originally proposed.
Thank you so much for sharing there. I do want to point to the chat just briefly. Paul mentions that we might want to take a look at how Shelby County addressed community engagement and understanding of their portrait, as that was their focus for their design prototype. And so I think that in terms of the district level an analysis and feedback, I know that will be covered as part of the sandwich, if you will. We've certainly collected data from our districts and look forward to learning more about what that looks like, specifically from those district stakeholders' perspectives. And then also another thing that I'll add, I think that in terms of our group, a next step might be looking at the data that we've collected thus far from our districts and considering what stakeholders in the areas where they've seen, from the district perspective, successful implementation, what it's looking like for them as individual stakeholders. And so kind of comparing that with the data that we've collected already. I definitely think there might be a next step there as well. I see that Dr. Flynn has said, I think we will continue to get resistance until the alignment to accountability is addressed. As long as accountability is high stakes, there'll be a strong incentive to align school and district efforts to that priority. Absolutely. All right. So, would anyone like to speak to that a bit about some of the? Okay. See, Julie has responded. Any other thoughts there?
Caleb, I think that's just something the board needs to discuss in depth, because that's kind of what I see with the districts that are more resistant of this kind of work. It's because that priority is a reality. Mm-hmm. There's a division of KDE that'll come in and do things, to you and with you if you don't get that accountability right. They're not going to come in right now on the portrait of a learner or some of these innovative strategies. And so that misalignment is, I think, our chief impediment. And I think that's why superintendents want this integration piece.
Okay.
So just to confirm, I did close the form again. So it was open for about a minute and a half. I closed it again. So if anyone squeezed in a response, we might be up to 24. But I did close it. So I think if you leave this meeting today feeling like there is a perspective that you really feel like is missing and that you want to ask some questions to people within your network and get that data to us, please just send us an email. It doesn't need to be formal, so that we can, we certainly aren't wanting to limit that, but I think kind of the formalized process we use for the task collection will conclude today. We won't collect any more on that form, but with Julie's guidance and the other board members, we'll think about the best way to continue to solicit feedback from shareholders in the months ahead. But again, please feel free to email Caleb, Tammy, and myself your thoughts and those of those members of your network so that we can bring as much to the board in August as we reasonably can.
And I'll go ahead and say, I hope you all are able to hear me. I know I've been in and out a little bit throughout this meeting, and I apologize for that. But certainly as we move forward, I know that I'm going to be thinking about your perspectives that you've brought today and the concerns and ideas and thoughts that you've mentioned as I continue to, I see Dr. Shack has said in the chat, what is missing are the voices from Dr. Glass's listening toward that led to Kentucky United We Learn, that desire for change. Okay, and I do think before I move forward with the thought that I was expressing there, I do want to say that I think that extensive degree of research is very much something that might come later for our.
Uh-oh. I think Caleb's it. He's frozen, it looks like. Oh, he's back. Caleb, you froze for a minute. And so
I hate that I did that. I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, I was just saying that as someone who is involved with that work, I certainly value including as many perspectives as we can in the work that we're doing. And so hoping that we can move forward with that in mind in finding those voices and including people as we think about implementation. And so we'll say that, and we'll also say that I'm going to be continuing to work on this presentation with your thoughts in mind, and moving forward. We'll certainly be thinking about the ideas that you shared here today. Want to be sure that that you feel and that you are included as we work on this presentation. And so it's so appreciated, your thoughts tonight and your willingness to speak up and share your perspective and so forth. So I want to thank you for that. Are there any other thoughts here as we kind of move forward? Are there any other ideas or any questions that might be lingering? I see Julie has raised her hand. I'll certainly turn things over to her.
Sorry.
You're good.
Edna nailed it. It's the framing on this. So if you've been in a district or have followed the districts like Shelby and Fleming County and things that are Kenton County that are doing, I mean, even when Meredith, when you guys presented to the interim committee and, you know, Representative Frank Frohnmeyer talked about being in the school for a defensive learning, I think it was an 8th grader. When I do the year-long projects that ignites the evaluations, when you've been exposed to it, your answers to this questionnaire would be completely different, where the people who probably answered haven't been exposed to it. So it's almost like you need some kind of video or storytelling of what this could look like or what it already does look like in places. And I think that almost changes that mindset, that framing of it. I think what a lot of the people who answered this, like Meredith's point, it goes back, they're equating it to portfolios because they don't know what this looks like. And so that's their reference point.
I agree with Julie wholeheartedly. You have articulated so well what I have been thinking during this entire meeting. And I was trying to think, well, what is it that could make Portrait of a Learner real to people that might be not as familiar? They're not in a district, an L3 district that has a local laboratory of learning concept, or not a Shelby County. So you articulated what I've been thinking, and I don't know the answer, you know, but we've got to give people enough information so they can respond.
Hey, Caleb, if I can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, Renee and Julie. I think something that came clear to me in looking at this task, if you will, is kind of almost bifurcating portfolio of a learner and the values around that and the competencies and stuff. And there was positivity around that. And then the leap over to, and oh, by the way, here's some proposed graduation requirements, react and respond to that in terms of benefits and challenges. And I will say, I mean, in looking at some of the responses, like there was positivity around the competencies that they might be familiar with. And if you remember, those of you who did the task, it was open season. You could share with them Kentucky's, the state, you know, the board approved portrait of a learner, or ask them to reflect on the local portrait of a learner that they're familiar with in kind of talking about an experience that maybe they had where they built competencies in their schooling background. And that was like the first question. So there are challenges, I think, in both of those buckets that I think KD is starting to address more aggressively is the wrong word, but anyway, in terms of building awareness around portrait of a learner. And we've started, and especially in the communications area and with combining resources with Sarah to try and this implementation study and stuff to gather more information about portrait of a learner coming to life at the local level and relaying that story to the board and sharing that progress with the board. And so there's progress made on that front, but then there's a definite difference between that and then asking people to like then switch tracks and talk about changes to graduation requirements. So I think in our conversation here, kind of separating the two is trying to keep them separate in our heads is kind of important. Interesting. Thanks, Meredith. In a symbiotic way. It's a great quote. We've used it a couple of times. But what I was going to share with you in looking at the implementation survey that we put together and put out to those districts that were fairly far along on the continuum of developing and implementing their localized portrait of a learner. Out of those 43, I believe, at least at last count, only 3 of them have included something in their graduation requirements connected to portrait of a learner, as in similar to what the KBE board is proposing. So that was also instructive to me, and I tried to keep that, knowing that data out of looking at this feedback. But I think that's also, and we're going to leave that information with the board. That's part of our shared learning with the board so that they can digest and think about that, is that if we have 3 districts in the state so far, only 3 or only 3, however you want to look at it, that have already gone down that far down the continuum, there's some work still, there's progress to be made and work to be done where more of the districts that are further along in implementing their portrait to then make the leap to include something in their grad requirements as well.
Quickly, I did want to say, so yes, Tammy, this is my favorite quote. And I will say, Chair Young is an outstanding chair and she has many fantastic quotes, but this is one that I think we need to have immortalized. But
oh, it's got the Archimedean in it.
That's
also.
right. That's
it's
right.
Like,
so
it's got the double header.
It has everything. So the reason that I shared that though, and the presentation to the board in August, that's actually what we've labeled that particular item on the agenda is, portrait of a learner and Archimedean lever. And I think it's important for us to remember, and I totally agree, that it feels a little abrupt to talk about grad requirements, right? That it almost loses the bigger, more complex goal. However, the board is a regulatory body, and so they have to they are able to influence the student experience through their regulatory actions. And so one thing that the board can do is change graduation requirements. And that's why we're saying that would be an Archimedean lever, right? So by having that expectation for students to be working toward that defensive learning upon prior to graduation, that kind of the culminating event of their educational career, the hope is that that will change the full experience up to that point, right? And that by having that there, waiting for them, then all of the instructional shifts that we are hoping to see, all the student experiences that are deeper and more multifaceted and get at all the different complexities of the student experience would happen, because we know that is sort of awaiting a student. So I agree that it doesn't really capture everything that was in the United We Learn report or all of the different parts of United We Learn that we hope to implement, but it is important for us to get to a place where, what are the steps that the board can take to make this a reality? So this is one that they can potentially consider. So those who are maybe watching the meeting can't see the quote, but you can Google Portrait of a Learner Kentucky, and that'll actually be one of the first returns, and you can see the full editorial piece that Chair Young wrote about the Portrait of a Learner, if you haven't already read it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm curious to know if we have any other thoughts here before we move forward on our agenda. I want to be sure we are providing a space for you to share your concerns and thoughts and so forth. All right, so hearing none, I will go ahead and wrap us up just by saying that it is absolutely a very heavy conversation to be had around not only this presentation, but around Portrait of a Learner and around graduation requirement changes and so forth. It is certainly a lot to think about. And so I recognize that, and I appreciate your willingness to speak up this evening and share your thoughts, and certainly we'll continue to pull from your ideas as I move forward in thinking about this presentation, and also as I think about next steps and as we collectively think about next steps for our group. And so I want to encourage you, and I do see that Dr. Brewer has mentioned in the chat. I'm getting ready to open the floor up for those. So but I do want to encourage you to feel free to reach out if you have any thoughts that might come to mind later. Feel free to reach out to me, and certainly would love to hear those if those do come up later. And as Dr. Brewer said in the chat, before we go, would any members like to share any updates? I know our Vice Chair Bentley White usually takes care of this part. However, he is not with us this evening. He is with the Governor's Scholars Program, so very excited for him to be experiencing that right now, but would certainly love to hear any updates related to United We Learn or the work that we're doing, if you have those. So now's a good time for that. Yes, I see Julie has raised her hand.
Okay, if you ask for announcements, I'm just forewarning you guys, I am always going to have announcements. The week of November 13th is going to be Kentucky Family Engagement and Education Week. That's something that the Pritchard Committee does, and the Kentucky Family Engagement Advisory Council. And so as we're Bold New Future and engaging community, maybe that's something we need to maybe look at, maybe partnering or being a part of that week.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Certainly something to think about as we think about the role that we're taking on as we engage with communities. Certainly something to think about. And so we're looking for those opportunities for community collaboration. Thank you for sharing. If there are no other updates, I do believe that we are ready to adjourn. I'm not sure of our upcoming meeting date. However, we'll certainly be in contact soon with a follow-up email after tonight's meeting. And I look forward to taking some time to think through to think through the conversations that we've had. And actually, I do see here now, I apologize. It appears our next meeting will be August 7th, 2023. Did not see that listed on the agenda, but I do see that here now. So August 7th, 2023. So make note of that. All right. Without anything else to say this evening, I guess it's we'll adjourn. So thank you all so much for being here. Appreciate hearing from all of you, and certainly wish you all the best until we meet again on August 7th.